Imagine this. You are 28 years old, your phone is buzzing on your desk, and somewhere on the other end of the world, a major bank is quietly dying because of you. For 3 years, you have been absolutely sure you could fix one small mistake. You were sure when the loss was $40,000. You were sure when it became $3 million. You were sure when it passed $100 million. You were still sure when the hole reached into the billions. And at every step, that confidence felt real. It felt rational. It felt earned. Until the day the police knocked on the door of your hotel room. Overconfidence is not just a personality quirk. It is behind some of the worst decisions in history, from financial crashes to engineering disasters. But it is not only about rogue traders and failed CEOs. It is in everyday life, inside all of us, all the time. Most people, for example, genuinely believe they are better drivers than the average person. Statistically, that cannot be true. Yet if you ask a room full of people, a huge majority will happily raise their hand. So here is the puzzle for this episode of Curiosium. Why do we feel so certain when we are actually wrong? And if our brains are this unreliable, is there anything we can do about it? Let us start with the trader who was sure he could not lose. Picture a crowded trading floor in Singapore in the early 1990s. Phones are ringing, printers are chattering, people are shouting prices over each other in a dozen accents. In the middle of that chaos, a junior trader makes a simple mistake. She is supposed to buy futures contracts for a client. Instead, she sells them. The error costs her bank about $40,000. Her boss, a young trader named Nick Leeson, does not want his team to look bad. He does not want his bosses in London to notice. So instead of reporting the loss, he hides it. He buries the mistake in a special internal account, one that is technically reserved for small errors that get fixed later. It has an almost comical label, account number 88888, 5 eighths. He thinks, I will win this money back quickly. No one needs to know. I am good at this. I can fix it. At this point, you could argue he is not a villain. He is just dangerously sure of himself. But then something interesting happens. Nobody at head office spots the missing money. No one calls. No one asks why there is a loss sitting in the error account. His rule breaking is rewarded with silence. And that silence feels like permission. If he got away with hiding one loss, maybe he can get away with a few more trades to dig himself out. So he places a bet on the Japanese stock market, believing it has fallen as far as it can fall and is about to bounce back up. Only it does not bounce. It keeps dropping. Every time the market moves against him, he doubles down. The logic in his head is simple. I cannot be this wrong. When the rebound finally comes, I will win back everything in one go. The hole grows from 40,000 to millions, then tens of millions. On paper, this looks insane. But inside his mind, something else is happening. Each extra risk feels justified because he has a story. I am smart. I understand this market. I just need a bit more time. Eventually, he does get his rebound. After months of losses, the market rises again. The secret account, the one with the 5 eighths, finally shows a positive balance. He goes out drinking to celebrate. He dances on tables. In his mind, the story is confirmed. He was right all along. His confidence is not shaken by the near disaster. It is reinforced. And then, almost immediately, another error appears. Another loss he does not want to admit. Back into the same account it goes. Back to the same strategy. Back to the same feeling. I escaped once. I can escape again. This is how a single hidden mistake slowly evolves into a $2.8 billion loss and the collapse of one of the oldest banks in the world. Nick Leeson is an extreme example, but he is not alien. The mechanism in his head is the same one in yours and mine. It is our tendency to overestimate how right we are. and to underestimate how wrong we could be. To understand the tendency more clearly, we need to leave the trading floor and walk into a psychology lab. Imagine you are taking a simple quiz. You are asked a bunch of general questions. Things like, is the continent of Australia wider than the moon? Are there more trees on Earth or more stars in our galaxy? Is a teaspoon of olive oil holding more chemical energy than the same mass of an explosive? For each question, you answer true or false. Then, for each answer, you also have to say how sure you are, from 0% to 100%. On the surface, this seems easy. You click your answers, you slide the confidence bar. Maybe you feel 80% sure about one question, 95% on another, 50% when you are just guessing. When psychologists run these experiments, they are not mainly interested in whether you get the questions right. They are interested in how your confidence lines up with your accuracy. Ideally, if you say you are 80% confident on a bunch of questions, you should be right on about 80% of those. That would mean your sense of certainty is well calibrated to reality. That is not what happens. Over and over again in studies with trivia, with logic puzzles, with skill tasks, even with expert economic forecasts, the same pattern appears. When people say they are 90% sure they are not right 90% of the time, they might be right 75% of the time, sometimes closer to 50. In one large online test, the group of people who rated themselves between 91 and 100% confident were correct only about half the time. If their confidence were a weather forecast, you would never trust it again. Psychologists call this mismatch miscalibration. Your inner feeling of "I am sure" does not track how often you are actually correct. And this does not only happen to random people on the internet. It happens to professionals whose job is to be right. In one study, chief economists at banks and corporations were asked each quarter to predict what would happen to key numbers in the economy, like inflation. They also had to say how sure they were in each prediction. On average, they rated their certainty a bit above 50%. Their actual accuracy was less than half of that. So overconfidence is not just ego. It is baked into how our minds estimate our own knowledge. But why? Why do our brains create such a strong feeling of certainty when the underlying information is so shaky? To explore that, let us look at a graph you may have seen floating around the internet. You might have seen a cartoon curve that looks like a small mountain with a cliff. On the left, when people know almost nothing about a topic, the curve shoots way up. Confidence is sky high, even though knowledge is low. As they learn more, the curve plunges into a valley of doubt. Finally, as they approach true expertise, the curve rises again in a calm, modest way. People call this the Dunning-Kruger effect. And that big hump on the left is sometimes labeled Mount Stupid. It is a funny picture. It makes us feel good, because we all know someone who seems to live permanently on that peak. But it is not actually what the original researchers found. In the late 1990s, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger ran a series of experiments. They tested people on grammar, on logic puzzles, and even on judging jokes. Then they asked each person how well they thought they had done compared to others. When they graphed the data, they noticed something interesting. People who scored in the bottom group genuinely believed they were above average. Their estimates of their own performance were way too high. People in the top performing group, on the other hand, tended to underestimate themselves slightly. They were actually better than they thought. So the effect is real. People who know very little often think they know much more than they do. And people who know a lot are often more cautious. But the data did not show a dramatic spike at the start and a deep valley later. Confidence ratings tended to cluster in a narrower band in the middle. The mountain is more of a gentle slope. Why does this matter? Because it suggests something subtle. Overconfidence is not just about being ignorant. It is also about the way we express our certainty. In many situations, people do not like to say, "I have no idea." Instead of using the full range from 0 to 100, we tend to answer somewhere in the middle. We compress our confidence. Poor performers pull their estimates up. Top performers pull theirs down. So part of the overconfidence problem is statistical. But that is not the whole story either. To really understand why we are so sure and so wrong, we need to look at the limits of our mental hardware. Think about the last time you tried to juggle too many details in your head. Maybe you were comparing mortgage options, or trying to plan a complex project at work, or just attempting to remember several numbers at once without writing them down. There is a hard limit to how much new information you can actively hold in your mind at one time. Psychologists call this working memory. For most people, it is only a handful of chunks. Now imagine you are on a high-stakes conference call, trying to protect the lives of astronauts. In January 1986, engineers at a company that manufactured rocket boosters for the space shuttle noticed something alarming. The predicted temperature for the next morning's launch was much lower than any previous mission. They knew that at low temperatures, the rubber seals in the booster joints became stiff. Stiff seals might not expand quickly enough to contain hot gases. They had just a few hours to review historical data, create charts, and persuade NASA managers not to launch. Across several hours, they produced over a dozen charts. There were graphs about the seal temperature at previous launches, notes about erosion, diagrams about how the joints moved, tables full of numbers. Each chart carried a piece of the story, but none of them put the whole picture together clearly. On the other end of the line, managers were trying to make sense of this scattered information while also juggling schedules, politics, and costs. Their working memory was full. There was no spare capacity to mentally integrate all those factors into one coherent risk estimate. In that overloaded state, it is easy to slip into a comfortable narrative. We have flown many times before. Nothing catastrophic has happened. The system must be robust. They approved the launch. The next morning, 73 seconds after liftoff, cold, hardened seals leaked. Flames escaped, the vehicle disintegrated, and 7 people died. This disaster had many causes, but one thread is the same human limitation we all share. When problems are complex, when data are noisy and incomplete, our brains are simply not good at holding everything in mind at once. Researchers have actually tested this in controlled experiments. In one study, people were asked to estimate things like the population of a city. But instead of giving a single number, they had to give a range. They were pretty sure would contain the true answer. Ideally, if you say you are 90% sure the real number is somewhere in your range, then the true value should land inside that range about 90% of the time. In practice, people's ranges were far too narrow. Even when they believed they were leaving plenty of room, they were still wrong much more often than they expected. And the people with lower working memory capacity were both less accurate and more overconfident. In another study, when people had to keep a string of letters in mind while judging their own performance, their confidence became less reliable as the memory load increased. The more mental juggling required, the worse their calibration. So overconfidence is not always arrogance. Often it is just our brain trying to do too many things with too little space. To cope with that, we rely on shortcuts. When a question is too hard, your brain quietly replaces it with an easier one. Suppose someone asks you, "How happy are you with your life overall?" To answer properly, you would have to scan across many areas: relationships, health, finances, purpose, daily pleasures, long-term goals. You would have to weigh them against each other. That is complex. Now suppose that just before that question, someone asks you, "How many dates have you been on in the last month?" If your dating life is going well, the warm glow from that answer tends to spill over. Without noticing, your brain may substitute the hard question, "How happy am I overall?" with the simpler question, how is my love life going right now? Experiments show that when the dating question comes first, people's overall happiness scores suddenly correlate strongly with their recent romantic success. But when the happiness question comes alone, that correlation almost disappears. This is one example of a heuristic, a mental shortcut. Most of the time, shortcuts work well enough, but they can also generate systematic errors called cognitive biases. Overconfidence is one of those. When you are asked, "How sure are you about this answer?" you are not really sampling all the evidence for and against. Instead, you may be unknowingly answering a different question, like, "How fluent did that answer feel in my mind?" Or, "How vivid is the first supporting example I can recall?" Or, "How much do I like the sound of this explanation?" Fluent answers, vivid memories, and pleasing stories all feel good. They create a sense of ease. But ease is not the same thing as truth. If all this is starting to sound hopeless, remember, if overconfidence was always bad, nature would have selected against it. People who charged into danger with too much certainty would have been removed from the gene pool long ago. But the world does not work that way. There are real benefits to being confidently wrong. Imagine you are watching a group of strangers work together on a difficult task. Maybe they are solving a puzzle, or negotiating a mock business deal, or planning a group project. Some people hang back, speak cautiously, and emphasize uncertainty. Others jump in quickly, state opinions boldly, and speak as if their view is obvious. Who do you think the group will follow? In controlled studies, when researchers measure people's actual ability on some task and then compare that to how people rate themselves, the overconfident people, those who believe they are better than they really are, tend to rise in status. They talk more. They assert their ideas more strongly. Other people who cannot see their internal error bars mistake confidence for competence. Even when their actual performance is only average, overconfident participants are more likely to become informal leaders. Their ideas shape the group's decisions. Our brains are tuned to respond to confidence. Brain imaging studies show that when people receive advice delivered in a confident tone, reward centers in the brain light up more strongly. Confident voices literally feel more satisfying to listen to. This creates a powerful incentive. If you are running for office, trying to get hired, pitching a startup, or just arguing on television, you know that sounding unsure is punished. Saying, "I might be wrong," is rarely a winning slogan. Saying, "I know exactly what to do," is. Demand for confidence encourages supply, even when that confidence is not justified. Nick Leeson understood this instinctively. While his secret trading account was bleeding money, the positions he wanted people to see were showing big gains. On paper, he looked like a star, a young prodigy generating huge profits in a complex market. His bosses did not truly understand what he was doing, but they did not want to admit that. It felt easier to believe the story of the genius trader with a magic touch, so they sent him more money. They gave him more responsibility. They gave him awards. His own overconfidence and their overconfidence fed each other in a loop. This feedback loop is not unique to finance. You can see it in politics, in technology, in punditry. A forecaster can be wrong in a spectacular way, blame unexpected events, and still be invited back as an expert. A charismatic leader can overpromise, underdeliver, and still win loyalty simply because their certainty is so appealing. So we end up in a world where strong confidence signals are rewarded more than quiet, careful doubt. That is dangerous because complex systems do not care how sure you feel. Markets, ecosystems, rockets, viruses, elections, they respond to reality, not to the story in your head. So the question becomes, given these biases, these limits, and these incentives, is there anything we can do to be less confidently wrong? The first step is brutally simple to say and surprisingly hard to do. Keep score. If you want your sense of certainty to mean anything, you have to track it against outcomes. That can be as mundane as writing down your time estimates for projects. When you tell a colleague, "I will probably finish this by Friday," treat that as a prediction with a probability. Maybe say, "There is a 60% chance I get you a draft by Friday." Then notice what happens. If 60% sure quietly turns into "it took me 3 more weeks," that is a calibration error. Over time, if you honestly record your guesses and check them, you start to build a more realistic map of your own reliability. The same goes for opinions about the world. If you are sure some stock will rise, some policy will pass, some technology will fail, write it down with a date and a confidence level. Check back later. Most people never do this. They remember the hits, forget the misses, and keep a story in their head where they are almost always right. The second step is to deliberately seek out disagreement. Overconfidence thrives in echo chambers. If you only hear from people who already agree with you, your brain gets no sharp feedback. Everything feels confirmed. The most accurate thinkers are often those who actively look for the strongest arguments on the other side. They ask, "If I am wrong, what would the world look like? What information might someone else see that I am missing?" This is not comfortable. It can feel like undermining your own authority, but it is extremely valuable. The third step is to expand your mental bandwidth when you make important decisions. You cannot magically grow your working memory, but you can change the way you use it. Write things down. Draw diagrams. Ask someone else to summarize your argument back to you and listen for gaps. Instead of juggling 10 factors in your head, put them on paper so your mind is free to notice patterns and contradictions. Finally, there is a deeper attitude that helps: intellectual humility. That does not mean pretending you know nothing. It means holding your beliefs with a kind of flexible grip. You commit when you need to, but you keep the door open to new evidence. In studies, the people who are best calibrated are not the ones who know the most facts. They are the ones who are most aware of what they do not know. They treat each new question as a chance to update their internal map, not as a test of their identity. Think back to the moments in your own life when you were most sure of something that later turned out to be wrong. Maybe it was about a job you thought was guaranteed, a relationship you were certain would last, an exam you thought you had failed or aced, an investment that could not possibly lose. In the moment, that feeling of certainty probably felt solid. Your body relaxed or tensed accordingly. Your internal narrator said, "I know how this will go." And then reality did not match the script. Overconfidence is not just a flaw that other people have. It is a side effect of how human minds work under complexity, under limited information, under social pressure. It can destroy banks and blow up rockets, but it can also simply nudge us, day after day, into small but costly mistakes. The goal is not to never be confident. Confidence is useful. It gets us to act, to try, to lead, to ship the project, to step on the stage. The goal is to have confidence that is earned, confidence that has been tested against feedback, exposed to criticism, and adjusted when the world pushes back. True wisdom is not about being certain all the time. It is about knowing when to say, "I might be wrong," and meaning it enough to actually listen. You have been listening to Curiosium. If this episode made you question your own certainty even a little, that might be the most accurate feeling you have all day.